You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 9th of July 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Are we any nearer a ceasefire in Gaza? Is AI really transformative or just incredibly stupid? And is airline security lightening up just a little bit? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Terry Stiastny and Yossi Mekelberg will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical series recalls the coup d'etat, which was also grounds for divorce. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Yossi Mekelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, and by Terry Stiastny, political journalist and author of Believable Lies. Terry, let's plug your book again.
Please do. It's a story about wartime propaganda and fake news, and I've just been off talking about it at the Penzance Literary Festival, where I had a really nice audience and got to go swimming in the sea. Available now. Seems to be doing reasonably well, I hope.
The audience were pleasant and equably tempered, rather. They weren't irate of Penzance.
Oh no, they were not.
Wasn't worth it. I did kind of
it was quick.
Tread all over the build up there. It was just wasted effort all round. Believable Lies, though, it is a non-fiction work. What does it tell us that we didn't already know about the espionage and similar machinations of that period?
It tells us that although we kind of have this myth that politicians during the war in Britain were all pulling together, all very sort of friendly and cooperative, they were still fighting like cats in a sack during this, not least where propaganda was concerned. And it also tells us that, fake news is not new, that people were doing this deliberately during the Second World War to try to undermine morale, but that it also had incredibly the same issues as we do with fake news now, that it destroys trust, it corrodes what people believe ultimately, and that's what a lot of people came to believe by the end of the war.
And that title again?
Believable Lies.
By Terry Stiastny. Yossi, regrettably you do not have an acclaimed work of non-fiction on a bookshelf near us right at the moment, but you have. Is there a seamless pivot here? There is not. You've been in Greece.
I've been in Greece and two big things happened. One, I missed Terry's book launch as a result of this. And the other thing, while I'm there, Israel decided to strike Iran really insensitively and inconsiderably to the fact that some people need to take holiday. But this happened there, but Greece was great. It was nice to take holiday after nearly 2 years without.
Which bits of Greece did you visit?
Corfu and Paxos. Paxos mainly became famous now because of a Netflix series. Mm-hmm. Everyone is flocking to Paxos and the prices went up, but it's still a very beautiful island, and so it was enjoyable, short of obviously following very closely what happened when missiles landing very close to my family, and let alone a war has erupted.
Well, we will start with the prospect or otherwise of any imminent peace in Gaza. It is a week, give or take, since Israeli officials heavily hinted that they weren't necessarily against the 60-day ceasefire proposed by US President Donald Trump, in which time Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has travelled to Washington, D.C. and offered to nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. However, it has more recently been reported that indirect talks in Qatar between representatives of Israel and Hamas have stalled, not for the first time, over the issues of how aid would be distributed during any ceasefire and how far Israeli forces would back off. Yossi, do we have to consider the possibility that either Hamas or Israel, possibly both, are not really negotiating in the best of faith here?
I think we can safely say that. And one of the reasons that they always have equal reasons to stop the war than to continue that. Not for the people's sake, but for all their own survival in power. If the war ends, then Netanyahu loses probably part of his coalition. But I think there is a twist in the tail, at least when the Israeli side is considered, because Netanyahu is already in election mode. And you see it for...
But also, haven't some of the non-headbangers offered to prop his government up if a deal can be reached?
So there is difference between propping his government and giving me a safety net in the Knesset when decision on a ceasefire. They said, you have a safety net now in the Knesset if you bring any ceasefire deal. We'll support you. That include the release of the hostages, possibly eventually end of war and reconstruction of Gaza. But they are not joining the coalition. Now, he calculates what's the best time for him to call election. Now, the war with Iran is regarded as a success. If he reaches a deal, he also can say, I ended the war, the hostages are back. He did something that he hadn't done for 21 months. He went to one of the communities that was worst hit on October 7. He didn't visit a single place that was massacred by Hamas. Avoided it because he knew it happened under his watch. When you went with his wife to visit, you knew that he's in election mode. That's how cynical is Netanyahu. Then he gets tailwind from Trump, with supporting him in the war in Iran, and secondly, intervening in legal processes in Israel, and all this is a witch hunt. You should stop this. You should stop this trial. Which, of course, it's not a witch hunt. It's a case that goes on for 5 years. So he probably looks at the Knesset is going into the summer recess on the 27th of July. So then he has all the summer to make a decision when he wants election. Between calling election and election, there are 3 months. It's different from the UK. So there are full 3 months. And probably is in the best position now that he probably will ever be to call election. And this is part of the calculus. The question is where a ceasefire is entering into his calculation. The visit to Washington this week, that many of us expected to see something come out of it, it was much ado about nothing. Short of nominating in a grotesque gesture Trump to the Nobel Peace Prize, but there is nothing beyond of putting pressure to end the war. Well, as you said, there are negotiations in Doha, but also this kind of negotiations are either everything is agreed or nothing is agreed. So until everything is agreed, we don't have a deal.
Terry, one other factor which may now be more of a thing than it has been for a lot of the last nearly 2 years is the decreasing patience of a lot of Israel's allies, with the possible and crucial exception of the United States. The UK, for example, granted that there has been a change of government during this period, but is now talking about even perhaps imposing sanctions on Israel if talks change. That would be a huge shift in UK government policy. Is it likely?
I think they seem to be moving more and more in that direction. I think I was just going to mention that it was quite interesting seeing when Emmanuel Macron was speaking yesterday in Westminster to the Joint House of Parliament. He was really quite strong on the need for an immediate ceasefire. He was really pushing that quite heavily, and I imagine that's something that will have come up in his discussions with Sir Keir Starmer over the last couple of days, and David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary as well, who has always been a bit more in favour of a ceasefire and has been pushing that again quite hard. He was asked about that by MPs over the last couple of days and seemed to be suggesting, yes, we've really got to move further and faster on that. And, Britain, the UK and France had pretty much been similar in taking similar positions in terms of talking about possible sanctions on members of the government. So I think, that line from those quarters at least does seem to be hardening a bit.
I mean, Yossi, we've talked a lot on these shows before about what it is Israel, specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, actually wants, what they would consider victory and a reason to end the war. But from where we're sitting right now, is it clear what Hamas wants? What possible victory can they still hope to try and pluck out of this disaster they have brought upon Gaza?
Hamas looking for a physical survival. Most of its leadership has been eliminated already. The leader, first Yahya Sinwar and then his brother Muhammad Sinwar, and the one that is running is also on walks in Gaza with a target on his back. So we know that many of them have been killed. So one thing is physical survival. The other thing is relevance. As a result of what happened, which many Gazan people will tell you that they should disappear or at least change dramatically. Now, it's unlikely that Hamas as an ideology, as an idea, is going to disappear. But the question if they can transform. If there is an agreement, for instance, some of their militants can be incorporated in a future defense force or police force, through also a process of DDR, of de-radicalization among Palestinians. So this is as part of a bigger conversation. But it's really, for them, it's to stay relevant, because regardless how much we criticize Israel, over the last 2 years and the way that it acts in Gaza, without October 7, this would not have happened. And Hamas must take responsibility for that. How it's going to pan out within the Palestinian political system, this is the big question of reform. And again, the people, even if they are members of Hamas, are still there and need to be they are part of the Palestinian society. And if I might add one point about the sanction, some sanctions are already dead in the suspension of the trade agreement. But we are thinking also always the negative of sanction. And there is something very positive that the British government can do, is recognizing Palestinian statehood together with the French. So I think this is even, not that I'm against some of the sanctions, but I think this is really send a clear message, even more than some of the punishment, that there is recognition Palestinian statehood and move on from there.
Just a final thought on that thought, Terry. Obviously, the Labour Party in this country and centre-left governments around Europe, indeed the previous Democratic administration in the United States, absolutely got earfuls from a lot of their own supporters over not taking a harder line on Israel. If the Labour Party here, which did lose seats in that election to single-issue Gaza campaigners, did come out with a fairly significant gesture, like either sanctions against Israel or, as Yossi suggests, recognising Palestine, would that, I guess, bring their coalition, their voter base back together?
It might do to a certain extent, but I think domestically people are still people who are, of that kind of point of view, or that section of the Labour Party, or people who've left the Labour Party, are still quite angry with this government, particularly about things like the idea of banning Palestine action and saying that is, sort of sympathetic under anti-terrorism legislation, really cracking down on protests. So I think they would have a balancing act to do. But I think if you step back from the domestic and looked at it in sort of international politics, then yes, clearly that would be a big shift. And I think people who were taking a more sort of mainstream view might appreciate that.
Well, let's move along, but we will continue with today's emerging theme of contemplating post-war arrangements for jurisdictions currently in a state of conflict. Later this week in Rome, starting tomorrow, in fact, 15 heads of state and/or government, among them President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, will gather for the latest annual Ukraine Recovery Conference. The idea of these, which have been held every year since 2022, is to try to form a long-term view of the two big questions which will loom over post-war Ukraine, i.e. what needs to be done and who is going to pay for it. What will be different about this one is the recent recognition that the answer to the second question might be not the United States, it turns out. Terry, the World Bank estimates, and I don't know where you begin to pull these estimates out of, $528 billion over the next decade to revive and rebuild Ukraine. Is this another moment perhaps for a significant declaration of intent from Europe, that Europe has been forced into making several of these over the last 6 months? But would this be a good moment for Europe to say, yeah, this is on us, this is on our continent, and we are equal to this?
Yes, you would hope that, certainly you've got leaders like Merz, like Ursula von der Leyen, there going to the conference. Obviously up until now, a lot of the focus has been on how much you can supply in terms of defence equipment, how much money you should be putting into that. And I think probably in the longer term, assuming that there is some kind of stability, European countries and European businesses would probably want to be contributing to that kind of rebuilding. I mean, it's interesting that there's about 2,000 companies signed up to go to this conference. So I think there's a kind of a mutual interest in establishing that, and I think particularly, again, harking back to what Macron has been saying, this idea that Europe has to kind of stand more on its own feet and not be reliant on outside support. I think that's kind of going to be quite an impetus behind it.
Yossi, as Terry correctly says, more than 2,000 companies are attending this because obviously the rebuilding of Ukraine will not be an exclusively charitable endeavour. People are going to make money from doing it, and you can see why Ukraine's allied governments would prefer that, because it means they won't have to tell their own voters that they have to pay for it. But is there a problem, though, or an inbuilt difficulty with mobilising private sector funds, in that people are not going to pay to build something if they think it might get knocked down again? Private sector companies are going to want a higher threshold of stability than perhaps allied governments might.
It just increases the risk. I can think in this case in Gaza, because very similar case in Gaza. There was a lot of money going there, and for a few rounds of war, the very same buildings that were built and schools and other institutions were destroyed. That's not a good model. The model should be a political solution that leading also to investment. So as you said at the beginning, we think about in terms of defense, making sure that, stabilizing the fronts, because again, we sat here in this studio on the very first day of the war in Ukraine, and we thought, is Russia going to completely run over Ukraine? And it didn't happen. And obviously it costs a lot of money. But at the same time, I think we need to think along more the Marshall Plan. Along the idea that this is not charity. A lot of companies will make money. Hopefully it will be in the cleanest possible way. It will create a lot of jobs. And again, hopefully it will create a lot of jobs in Ukraine. So there is a process there and we saw it after the Second World War, that actually it creates a situation in which there is a very, very rapid economic development. I mean, it's not the way to do it to begin with, starting a war, destroying a country, and then rebuild its economy. But still, this is the position we are. We have to look at what's the best way to move forward in which everyone benefits, so you get the knowledge and the investment from the outside. They will ask to look money. We live in a capitalist system, but at the same time make sure that Ukrainian people benefit, Ukraine in the long term benefits from that.
Terry, is there a symbolic importance to these conferences as well? I think there clearly was with the first one. It was trying to establish as a fait accompli that there will be a Ukrainian recovery, there will be a post-war. Is it still important to keep people focused on that?
Yes, I think you've got to be able to take this longer term view. And, I think it is a sign, by having particularly European leaders turn up there that, whatever, they can officially express, they are still thinking of Ukraine as a European country, as part of the European economy, as something that they can, eventually in the long term, perhaps, help to recover. So I think, having this high level. And, as we've been saying, it's self-interested as well. They want to have stability. They want to have, an important economy there and trading. So I think, the danger is that it just becomes a talking shop, that it goes on too long. And if they're still all meeting in 5 years' time and there's no recovery and there's no stability, then, what use is the conference?
Well, just finally on this one, Yossi, obviously Ukraine did do a deal with the United States over its minerals, attempting to embrace America in mutual self-interest. And that deal is theoretically still operative. But do we get the sense here that Ukraine and Europe are trying to teach themselves not to assume that America is going to help them?
I think we just saw the suspension of air defense systems supplied to. So the United States, definitely under Trump, is not a reliable ally. And as much as we saw, for instance, the pandering during the NATO summit recently, and all these kind of daddy messages from the General Secretary of NATO to Trump, I think we learn in Europe, and Canada as well as a member of NATO, that the United States is not a reliable ally, and as a result, the increase first 2% expand on defense and then goes 2.5 to 5%. It's part of that. At the same time, according to some of these estimates that I also don't know how they get, that there are $26 trillion worth of minerals in Ukraine. So let's assume this is correct. This is a lot. So I think if we are becoming more agile and understand there are risks in doing that, but there are also opportunities. And at the end of the day, Ukraine is in Europe. It's a European interest more than an American interest. And if that is the direction of the United States is taking, and we are not so sure who is going to be the president after Trump, assuming there is a president after Trump, that's when Europe needs to reassert itself. And this is a positive step towards Europe reasserting itself.
Well, two developments in the exciting world of artificial intelligence, and one person AI does seem to have put out of work is Linda Yaccarino, CEO of the X, formerly known as Twitter, who has announced her resignation, possibly not coincidentally the day after X's in-house AI chatbot Grok started enthusing about Adolf Hitler, among other racist outbursts which were, in fairness, models of sober analysis compared to what many of X's human users post all the damn time. In other heartwarming AI news, human workers recently canned by Microsoft in favour of AI. Regrettably not the people responsible for the latest update to Outlook, but folk at Xbox Game Studios have been advised by their now former boss to seek help from AI. Terry, do we hope that he received some advice in the replies to his message?
Yeah, I think perhaps people were typing into, how shall I tell my boss to go and jump in a lake? I mean, type that into ChatGPT.
Yeah, well, which lake should I tell him to go and jump in?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these AI suggestions are not generally very helpful. But when you look at the list of what, tell people to do, it's, how, ask ChatGPT how you should update your CV or how you should tell people that you're looking for work. I mean, I'm sure most people can manage to do that for themselves.
Well, you would hope. But there is partly, I think, folk skeptics such as myself, Yossi, are concerned that people outsourcing human thought to what is essentially a speak-your-weight machine is going to have no end of unpleasant consequences. But are you still hoping, as I am, that the whole AI thing turns out to be just a massive bust like the metaverse or like NFTs or like any other sort of 23rd century bollocks people have attempted to foist on us in the last decade or so?
So obviously, on definitely more than one mind. One that says technology evolved along the centuries, and every time that technology changed and evolved and were introduced with something new, there was those who opposed it and said, this is going to society and humanity.
I've been consistently more or less against everything.
So then he said, and some of this actually help us, for instance, to extend our lifespan, increase our health, feed humanity and the rest. Then this is different. This is not the same of inventing the car or inventing X-ray or all of these great things. And this is actually to change us as humanity, and we should really be worried. And of course, you might say that with all this Hitler and anti-Semitic thing, I might have vested interest against this kind of tweets.
I mean, I would hope we would all, Yossi, have a vested interest against such things.
I hope so too. But I think, obviously, when you get to this kind of discourse and legitimize, and regardless, joking aside, hate speech as a result of it, and there is so much created, then you start worrying. And then the real idea, how we make the most difficult thing with technology is the transition. And who suffers in the process of the transition? And, we can already think the daily, the AI version of the daily. And all of this kind of, just imagine. And
how do people know this isn't?
So we got news for you. But that's the danger, is that many people are losing their jobs. Many people are left, wondering what's going to happen next. Again, I mentioned before, in academia, we are really at loss, but not knowing what essays are submitted because they sat really late at night, as we used to do that, with plenty of coffees, and one that were produced within, is it 5 seconds, 3 seconds? I'm not so sure on an AI.
But there's a solution to that, Yossi. You just lock them all in a freezing lecture hall with a blank piece of paper and a pen for 3 hours. So make them do exams like I had to, damn it.
So what I do, for instance, I run simulation with them, so they can fake it, and then they have to reflect. They have to reflect on the simulation games, and you can't reflect on something that AI did for you. So I agree with you, but there is a lot of the other too.
Terry, returning to Grok's enthusiasm for National Socialism, quite a lot of which I think has now been taken down, not least because you would have to imagine that those few inexplicable advertisers who haven't deserted X by now would have done so as a consequence. Does it not demonstrate, this is a leading question, one of the perils of large language models such as Grok, in that they are by definition only as good as what they're trained on. And if what you are trained on is to a large extent, the absolute torrent of nonsense that is largely broadcast by X these days, it's only going to be as good as what gets put into it.
Well, literally, garbage in, garbage out is one of those well-known expressions. And yeah, if you keep feeding the model language that is full of hatred, full of conspiracy theories, you are spreading that. That is exactly what's going to come out, and it's going to come out amplified, because Grok is not checking these things against the truth or against the real world. I mean, I was talking, as I mentioned about the book, the importance of building trust and actually telling people things that are true, because the more you spread these rumours or conspiracies, the more that is going to be regurgitated.
But who is accountable then? Who takes responsibility?
Maybe
when AI
has done.
When AI start going to war, and we're sending all these machines that decide who they kill, who they take hostage, are the people that build it, people that program, people that send them, release them. So there is issue of accountability as well.
I can recommend a now quite old and possibly overtaken by events episode of The Foreign Desk, which did get into that just a little bit. Just finally on this one, Terry, because there is a domestic British political angle as well. The Prime Minister here, Sir Keir Starmer, today rather ducked under a question about whether it was appropriate for a government to continue using a platform as compromised as X. I mean, that would be a significant step if a major government pulled the plug on it.
I think, or at least if they started to use other platforms as well, because I've found doing sort of politics coverage, you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't use X so much, but, government announcements are on there, MPs are on there, and certainly on the alternatives, like things like Blue Sky, you tend to get more of a, you'll find lots of Labour MPs on there and almost no Conservatives. So, if you're trying to find out what's going on, you need to look at it. And I think, yes, more people at least duplicating or moving away would certainly be a good thing at this point.
And some steps, perhaps, back towards the olden days of flying, when honest citizens could all but take their grenade launchers and scimitars aboard as carry-on without the pettifogging harassment of security officials. In the United States, it will no longer be mandatory to remove one's shoes prior to passing through airport security, while in the UK, Edinburgh and Birmingham airports have waived off the 100ml limit for liquids in hand luggage, as their new scanners can cope with bottles of up to 2 litres. All in all, a good day for frequent flyers between the US and British regional airports who wear 20-hole Doc Martens and enjoy cider. Terry, goths, now that I think of it, must be absolutely delighted. Are these sensible reforms?
It's just the question, the difficulty at the moment is knowing which airport you're going through. I mean, I went through Stansted recently, and the signs say one thing and the officials tell you another thing. And it turned out that once you moved queues, they said, oh yeah, if you're in the queue on the left, you don't need to take your liquids out of your bag. But however, the queue on the right, we haven't got the new machine in there yet, so you still do need to take them out. So you can't know, even if you're going from one airport and coming back from another, and you've taken your large bottle of gin or your bottle of perfume or whatever, you might still have to throw it away because they've got a different system at the other end.
It is 24 years, incredibly, Yossi, since Richard Reid, the shoe bomber, or mercifully attempted shoe bomber, who brought this misery upon us. This does demonstrate, doesn't it, one of the difficulties of you impose a new security measure, that's one thing. Withdrawing the security measure, that can take a lot longer.
So anyone that ever served in the military, you know that when your commander says, we have a temporary measure, and you know the rest. 20 years later, 30 years later, it's still there, and no one even remembers why they actually introduced this temporary measure, talking from experience. But reality, yes, I mean, technology, that's where technology changes, and as a result of it, you can actually examine some of that. And we all go, I went actually on this holiday and decided the random check about everything that I had in the bag and ensuring that I don't have any explosives. But I thought about the 2-liter thing is great because I can take 2 liters of the new Trump perfume with me to wherever I go.
I did want to ask, or close by asking you each in turn, what is the most irritating, pettifogging, trivial interaction you've ever had with airport security in this security-blighted century? I am going to start by relating, I was flying to Australia, I think about 2004, and it was a flight which landed in Brisbane before carrying on to Sydney, so obviously you'd have to get off the plane in Brisbane, go through security, and get back on the plane for the last short leg. And just as I was getting off the plane, I jostled my glasses and knocked out that tiny little screw which holds the arm of the glasses onto the frame. I did find the tiny little screw, and I did say something out loud to the effect of, in leadenly sarcastic tones, God, if only somebody on the plane had a really little screwdriver. And this woman behind me said, I have. It turned out she was a professional bassoonist, and this was part of the maintenance kit. So she very kindly lent me that, and I was adjusting my glasses while we were chatting in the queue to go back through security, and I've never felt so embarrassed to be Australian, incredulous as people will be at that remark. He took it off. He confiscated it. He said, you have to give me that. I said, it's not mine. It's actually belongs to this distinguished bassoonist. And he wouldn't give it back to her. Even when I said, what if I promised to be responsible for any mayhem she may cause with a inch-long tiny screwdriver between here and Sydney?
Probably still some concert that never happened because her bassoon wasn't properly tuned. You know?
So can anybody beat that?
I can't beat it, but just the arguments that I've had about what constitutes a liquid and whether a jam or a soft cheese is in fact liquid or solid, and trying to argue the case.
Oh, that's amazing. I have not got into a conversation about the nature of liquid at airline security. That's fantastic. Yossi, you've flown in and out of Ben Gurion. Surely you can top this.
Actually, I have 2 stories not from the Ben Gurion. One very quickly. I have friends in Luxembourg, and I'm getting a room to stay there only if I cook for them shakshuka. Okay. You can't get harissa in Luxembourg. So I need to bring this
Sounds
chili.
like the opening line of a Lloyd Cole song.
So I come with this small can of harissa to the airport, and the guy, for the life of him, can't understand why I'm carrying that and whether it's, again, a liquid or not liquid. And it took consultation of 20 minutes. I didn't miss the flight.
Amazing.
But my mother-in-law had probably the best story of this.
We don't do enough mother-in-law routines on the day.
I mean, what she managed to do was basically the guy that let her go with a huge knife on an airplane. And when he found the knife, he said, my daughter is getting married and this is for the wedding cake. And she managed to convince him that she should get on the airplane with a huge knife to cut a cake, and she arrived with it to London. And when we saw this knife, I nearly fainted because I thought, something I won't mention the airport in the United States. There was some lax there with security.
I don't really know what to say to that. I'm actually now outraged in the other direction. That's clearly somebody not being pettifogging enough.
Apparently not.
Extraordinary. Terry Stiastny and Yossi Mekelberg, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our regular On This Day historical feature reflects on a manoeuvre ruthless even by the standards of Russian politics.
Let's talk of Catherine the Great. Let's talk of love and the power of the state.
Staging any kind of coup d'etat self-evidently requires a ruthless streak. You are seeking to seize the greatest of prizes from someone theoretically protected by all the buttresses of a state, an army, a police force, a palace and or presidential guard. When you set yourself at the ruler you're seeking to depose, you must be prepared to condemn them to exile, imprisonment or execution. They will assuredly do any or all of the above to you if you get it wrong. And that's just the resolve necessary to orchestrate the downfall of a merely political enemy. A whole other depth of purpose is necessary to overthrow your own husband. On July 9th, 1762, that is exactly what one ambitious usurper did. A 33-year-old Prussian princess who had been born Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst and had become Grand Duchess Catherine of Russia, elbowed aside her spouse, Tsar Peter III, and completed the transition to Empress Catherine II, better remembered as Catherine the Great. Actual 18th century Russian music, that. We don't just crank this stuff out. Peter III was an unsympathetic victim. He was also Prussian by birth and had been roped into the Russian line of succession by his childless aunt, Empress Elizabeth of Russia. Elizabeth had fixed Peter's marriage to Sophia Augusta Frederica in 1745, but whatever other virtues Elizabeth possessed, and by the standards of her age, and indeed by the standards of Russia generally, she was a relatively progressive tyrant, she wasn't much of a matchmaker. Catherine could not stand Peter. In her splendidly bitchy memoirs, published to considerable sensation in 1859, several decades after her death, she depicted her husband, then Grand Duke of Russia, as a dim, lazy buffoon, obsessed with toy soldiers, boring parties, and other idle diversions.
In the country, the Grand Duke formed a pack of hounds and began to train dogs himself. When tired of tormenting these, he set to work scraping on the violin. The Grand Duke played with his puppets till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. Willing or unwilling, I was obliged to share this interesting amusement. I often laughed, but more frequently felt annoyed and even inconvenienced.
Peter didn't much care for Catherine either. He reportedly expressed mystification as to the paternity of her 3 or possibly 4 children, certain only that they could not have been his. Neither made much effort to conceal their prolific infidelity from the other, though Catherine was sufficiently miffed to refer in her memoir to one of her husband's mistresses, the Princess of Courland, as a
deformed little creature
and a
hunchback.
So there. Peter became Emperor of Russia on the death of Elizabeth in January 1762, a prospect about which Catherine had reservations, as later expressed in a letter to Stanislav Poniatowski, King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania, also a notch on Catherine's mercilessly whittled bedpost, probable father of one of her children.
Peter had lost the small share of sense which naturally belonged to him. He openly offended all parties. He wished also to change the religion of the country, marry Elizabeth Vorontsov, repudiate me, and place me in confinement.
Perhaps most vexingly from Catherine's perspective, Peter proposed to repair Russia's relationship with his native Prussia, and though this was of course Catherine's native Prussia as well, she had grown enamoured of more or less every aspect of Russia except its Tsar. She wasn't alone. Various intriguers and courtiers had tried to interest her in unloading her husband, who foolishly chose to spend summer at the seaside retreat of Oranienbaum, leaving Catherine to connive and plot. Among the principal connivers and plotters was another of her lovers, and father of at least one of her other children, Count Grigory Orlov. On this day 263 years ago, they and their troops made their move, as herewith depicted in 1934's The Scarlet Empress, starring Marlene Dietrich as Catherine.
We soldiers in the service of the Holy Russian Empire do hereby solemnly swear to acknowledge and to defend with our lives the authority of Catherine, our Empress, and to destroy our enemies.
Overthrown despots rarely enjoy long or comfortable retirements, and Peter proved no exception to the rule. Though Catherine claimed to have made generous provision for him, she acceded to all his requests bar one for his latest mistress. He was dead within the fortnight, aged 34. The official cause alcohol-inflamed piles, colic and apoplexy, but suspicions persist that he was helped on his way, possibly by Orlov's younger brother, Count Alexei. Catherine's reign would be rather more consequential, all 34 years of it. It wasn't all bad. When not seething at or cheating on her husband, she'd gotten massively into Enlightenment philosophers, even befriending Voltaire and Diderot, and accordingly steered some important reforms to justice and education, and spent big on the arts and sciences. However, she was not the first or last Russian ruler to decide that their vast country simply wasn't big enough. It was on Catherine's watch that Russia acquired, among other territories, Crimea, a chunk of Ukraine, and a Black Sea shoreline. For someone who has been dead 229 years, she continues to cause a great deal of trouble. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Terry Stiastny and Yossi Mekelberg. The show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.